Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for RP Strength. I'm with one of my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Milo Wolf, who is a sports scientist, an exercise scientist, and a published author and specialist on how to make sure you get the most out of your training. The corollary of that is he knows a lot about how to not get the most out of your training. And one of the ways you can really screw yourself in your training, not in a big, mega meta way, but in a little low key, but still matters way, is by choosing exercises that, well, how do I say it, just aren't that great. So we're gonna show you about 6 exercises that you might have done before. You see people doing in the gym all the time, and well, without putting too fine a point in it, they kind of suck. We'll show them to you. We'll explain why they suck a little bit. And that's it. Good luck figuring out your own shit. No, wait, just kidding. We're gonna show you exercises that are awesome replacements that are better. That doesn't mean these exercises always suck. Variation is a thing, context is a thing, but on average, we think the exercises that Milo is gonna show you are gonna be better than the ones that you're used to doing. We'll show you both, we'll get into it. Milo, I know that recently you've had trouble speaking. Do you wanna say something? All right, let's get to it. All right, folks, first exercise. Dr. Milo Wolf, let us know why you hate the bent over row.
Well, there are a few things. It's not that I hate it. It's there are simply better exercises. Specifically, the bent over row, depending on how you do it, has a few issues. First, if you do it dead stop, that is to say you put the weight all the way down at the bottom, you're missing out on a very important part of the range of motion, the stretch. Based on a lot of the research I'm involved with on long muscle length training being beneficial for hypertrophy, the one thing we don't want to do in an exercise, in all likelihood, there's other things too, but is to avoid that stretch position. By putting the weight down, all of a sudden, you're not getting that full stretch. You don't have to control the weight in that position anymore. So that is one issue. The second issue is you're bent over. Those postural muscles, the glutes, adductors, hamstrings, lower back muscles, they're being fatigued, and if nothing else, it increases fatigue generated by the movement. It reduces the likelihood of the actual target muscle being the limiting factor, that is to say the upper back musculature, potentially your rear delts, and so forth. And so that's the second limitation. And finally, the exercise is inherently most difficult in the shortened position. This is a limitation of many back exercises. Unless you have access to prime machines, which fortunately this gym does, most back exercises are hardest in the shortened position. Pull-ups, hardest when you get to the top. Pull-downs, hardest when you get that peak squeeze at the bottom. Most people can't touch the bar to their chest anymore. Bent over rows, the same issue. It's hardest to get the bar to touch your belly. And so as far as resistance curve goes, both on the lengthened end, when you do a dead stop row, not ideal, and on the shortened end, it's most difficult. So it's kind of just the worst of both worlds as far as that goes. So instead, let me show you a better exercise that is going to produce more hypertrophy on average in your back. Instead, I would recommend doing the chest-supported T-bar row. I mentioned 3 issues earlier with the dead stop barbell row. This fixes all 3 and has another benefit on top. First, as far as getting a full stretch, unless you're 7'5", you'll never have an issue with getting a full stretch on this machine.
And I'm not 7'5". I'm 7'4".
He's actually 4'2" in real life. Don't let the height deceive you. You will never have an issue with getting a stretch on this machine. You can get as deep as you want. In fact, you could even turn it into a flexion row, where you purposely flex the spine on the way down, stretching the erector musculature, and then extending it on the way up, which actually has the benefit of also growing your erectors, right? And specifically, this machine with a chest pad, it makes it a lot easier to focus on moving your spine as opposed to your hips. That is why I typically prefer a chest-supported machine or T-bar row over something like a cable row. In a cable row, for most trainees who aren't used to just moving their spine, they will default to just going all the way forward and all the way backwards. That is fine, but you are extending the hips on the concentric. You're involving your hamstrings, glutes, and adductors more than necessary. It's not improving your back stimulus, it's just involving other muscles. A chest pad makes it a lot easier to focus on the spine. Additionally, because of the way a T-bar moves, the moment arm is greatest at the very bottom, meaning the resistance is going to increase as you reach into that stretch position and decrease as you reach into that shortened position. Essentially, the opposite of the bent over dead stop row. In the bent over dead stop row, you have no tension at the bottom, and it's most difficult to top. This at least somewhat remedies that issue by having the moment arm decrease as you shorten the back musculature. Next up, we have leg extension. It's not a bad exercise. I just think there are better choices. There's a few reasons why the leg extension probably isn't the best quad builder out there. Let me break it down. First, when it comes to training the quads, there's going to be two categories of exercises. Compound exercises that do a good job of training three heads of the quads, the vastus lateralis, medialis, and intermedius, but the rectus femoris is best isolated, just through pure knee extension. That's because it also acts as a hip flexor, which means when you're squatting or doing compound whack, it's being lengthened at one joint, shortened at the other, which isn't great for hypertrophy. We have a study on the squat, for example, showing exactly this. Because of that, we also want to have some sort of quad isolation movement in your program. The leg extension is the one most people default to, but I think there are better options. First, the way most leg extension machines are built, they don't really allow you to extend your hips. When you're extending your hips, you're further lengthening the rectus femoris muscle that this is really trying to target ultimately. Because we have to bend forward, we can't really extend the hips that much. That muscle isn't being fully lengthened. For maximum hypertrophy, we will want more of a stretch, just like any other movement. Additionally, most leg extensions have a resistance curve that makes it hardest at the very top of the repetition. It's relatively easy at the bottom. In fact, you could do a lot more weight just doing half reps at the bottom, but it's quite challenging at the top of the rep. Once again, we have studies comparing these resistance curves, broadly speaking, finding better muscle growth when the exercise is hardest in the lengthened position. So these two things make it not the best quad exercise. Instead, here's another exercise I would recommend. Instead, what I would do, if you're strong enough, is the reverse Nordic curl. This is not an easy exercise. If you're not strong enough to do these, you can do sissy squats, or you can even do a leg extension. But if you are strong enough, I would urge you to try this. In the reverse Nordic curl, we're overcoming the two issues of leg extension. First, it is best if you fully extend your hips. This is going to lengthen the rectus femoris, this part of the quad here that you see poking out when you lean, more than a leg extension. Additionally, the resistance curve in leg extension, typically not very good. On this, you get the exact opposite. When I'm at the top of the repetition, I have essentially no force production requirements. It's the super easy part of the range of motion when my quads are relatively shortened. As you go further back and back, the moment arm acting at the knee increases and increases, increasing the tension as you lengthen all of the quad muscles. This is probably the most lengthened biased quad exercise I can think of. So if you can do this, give it a shot. Especially if you're new to these, they may feel a bit uncomfortable at first. What I would urge you to do, just for overall comfort, is to go pretty slow. Slow down more and more as you reach into that lengthened position. Sorry. Out of breath. 3 reps. This is not good. Slow down more and more as you reach into that bottom stretched position. It'll make it more comfortable, and it's also increasing the emphasis on the stretch by some amount. Next up, we have the seated calf raise, or in this case, something jerry-rigged to make it look like a seated calf raise. There's a good reason Dr. Mike Isvertel does not have a seated calf raise machine. We have a couple studies now comparing the seated calf raise to a calf raise with the knees extended, like a leg press calf raise or a standing calf raise, or any of that sort of calf raise. These two studies find similar things. Specifically, there's two parts of the calves. There's the soleus muscle and the gastroc muscle. When it comes to the soleus, these two studies found similar hypertrophy. When it comes to the gastroc, on the other hand, they found substantially more hypertrophy from the standing calf raise versus the seated calf raise. And this makes sense. And that's for one reason. The soleus only inserts at the ankle. Whether you're doing calf raises with your knees extended or flexed, it doesn't really matter. But when it comes to the gastroc specifically, it is a biarticular muscle, meaning it inserts at the knee and at the ankle. And so how your knee is positioned is going to influence how long the gastroc is during the exercise. In a seated calf raise, by flexing the knee, you're shortening the gastroc since it acts as a knee flexor. However, when your knees are extended, you're actually further lengthening it. So a seated calf raise is a more shortened exercise for the gastroc, whereas the standing calf raise is a more lengthened exercise, placing a greater stretch, which for hypertrophy is a good thing. There are other differences between these two exercises, like some people might argue that the gastroc is being placed into active insufficiency during the seated calf raise, and that's why it doesn't grow as much. That may or may not be true, But at the very least, I think there are better exercises out there than the seated calf raise. Instead, any sort of calf raise variation with your knees extended is going to do. The most accessible one that nearly everyone, whether you're in a gym or not, will have access to is a single leg bodyweight calf raise. All you gotta find is something elevated that's reasonably stable, and congratulations, you can train your calves quite effectively in an effective rep range, placing a lot of stretch under tension on the gastroc, which, based on these two studies I mentioned, by Kinoshita and our own lab, is going to result in more overall calf growth. Next up, we have a shoulder exercise. Now, you will see this exercise in many gyms, and you might be doing it yourself. It's a fine exercise if all you have are dumbbells, but there are better options out there. Broadly speaking, the same limitations that apply to the bent over row also apply here. For no apparently good reason, you're bending over, creating further fatigue in the hip extensors, the hamstrings, glutes, adductors, and lower back, which is doing nothing to increase the stimulus for the rear delts. Next, the resistance curve is such that at the very bottom, you have essentially no active tension being produced. There are no force production requirements for you to move the weight. Then, as you shorten the rear delts more and more, getting to that peak contraction, you need to produce more and more force. From a resistance curve perspective, based on some of the results from my research, that's suboptimal. Finally, if you want to stretch your rear delts, going here, you're not going to feel much of a stretch. If you actually go across your body, all of a sudden, you will feel your rear delts being stretched out. That never happens in this exercise. So we're adding additional fatigue by bending over. We're not getting a very effective resistance curve, and we're not getting the best stretch possible. These are three big issues with this exercise that fortunately can be resolved with a different, better exercise.
What do you get when PhD sports scientists collaborate with pro bodybuilders? The most effective muscle growth training app ever made. Get yours now.
Instead, I recommend the rear delt cable crossover. The movement is essentially the opposite of a cable chest crossover. You start with your arms overlapping, and then you go all the way back to get a peak contraction in your rear delts. But this has a couple advantages over the rear delt dumbbell fly. First, you're not bending over, creating unnecessary fatigue. You're standing, you're relaxed, you can focus on what your rear delts actually do best. Second, by setting up with the cables orthogonal to a line of pull at the start of the rep, we're maximizing tension in the rear delts at the start of the rep. And finally, this is about the only exercise, the cable rear delt crossover, where you're getting a pretty full stretch on your rear delts. No machine that's pre-built, no dumbbells will ever allow you to get as much of a stretch in your rear delts. By having your arms crossed over, you can more deeply stretch your rear delts. All right, next up, we have a pushing exercise. This one's being used by everyone ever, basically. It's a good exercise. It's the push-up. You don't need any equipment. It offers a decent resistance curve and a decent range of motion. But there are ways to make it better. Most people can get a deeper stretch in their chest than they get in a push-up by simply going deeper. One big issue: the ground gets in the way. And the second issue is that for most people, the body weight isn't really enough resistance to get into a super effective or practical rep range. If you do push-ups with your body weight, just regular push-ups, you'll often find you can get 20, 30, 40, 50 reps. Some of these rep ranges are fine for hypertrophy if you push close enough to failure. The issue with that is that we actually have a review paper looking at how effective or how accurate people are at gauging how close to failure they are. It turns out that when you go above around 12 to 15 reps, for most people, they start overestimating how close to failure they really are. Additionally, the push-up is quite challenging to load. So we don't really have too much of a choice but to do really high reps if we get quite strong. So to make the stretch better and to make us able to be in a more effective rep range, or at least a rep range that makes it easier to get close to failure, here's a better option. There's a couple of ways we can take the push-up and make it into a better exercise for muscle growth. First, let's address the stretch component. By elevating our hands, we're able to get to a deeper position, getting a deeper stretch into the chest, the triceps, and the front delts, and even the serratus anterior. So essentially, just creating more of a stretch on all of the involved muscle groups. This will also make the exercise more challenging, allowing us to get into a heavier or lower rep range than we would with a regular push-up. In order to further improve on this issue, we can also elevate our feet. This will do two things. First, it'll turn the movement into more of an incline pressing variation. The only study we actually have looking at chest growth from a flat pressing variation versus an incline pressing variation by Chavez and colleagues found greater upper chest growth when doing an incline pressing variation at 45 degrees of an incline versus a flat press, and found similar lower chest growth. So all else being equal, an incline pressing variation may be a slightly better option for chest growth, if you had to pick just one. So turns it into more of an incline, making it potentially a little bit better for overall chest growth. But secondly, it also makes the movement more challenging. Just like an overhead push-up is more challenging than a regular push-up, this essentially goes right in between the two. It makes the movement a little bit more challenging than a regular traditional push-up. The dumbbell kickback. These used to be a lot more popular, but they're still being done nowadays. The dumbbell kickback has many of the same limitations I mentioned earlier when it came to the bent over rear delt dumbbell fly. For one, you're bent over for no apparent reason. Many of the good tricep exercises out there don't require you to bend over and create additional fatigue to your postural muscles. However, it also has both a resistance curve issue and a shoulder positioning issue. The resistance curve is such that it gets more and more challenging as you shorten the triceps. In fact, the lift only really starts when your elbow angle is already at 90 degrees. That's kind of when the lift starts. So it's a shortened partial by design. Your shoulder positioning is also not sufficient to maximize the stretch on the long head. The triceps, as the name implies, have three heads: the long head, the lateral head, and the medial head. The lateral and medial head do not insert at the shoulder. So whatever you do with your arm, it's not going to influence their muscle length. But the long head does insert at the shoulder. And specifically, it is a shoulder extensor, meaning that when you flex the shoulder, its length increases. So instead, here is a better exercise that, one, takes care of the postural issue, two, creates more of a stretch on the long head specifically, and three, has a much more favorable resistance curve and is not a shortened partial. Instead, what I would recommend doing is some sort of overhead extension variation. If I had to pick just one tricep exercise for building muscle, it would be an isolation exercise. We have a study by Dumbbell and colleagues comparing the skull crusher to the bench press exercise, generally finding better overall tricep growth from an isolation exercise. And it makes sense. The triceps are, by definition, the limiting factor. They're the only muscles that can actually extend the elbow. But specifically, in the case of the overhead extension, we're positioning the shoulder in a way that maximizes the stretch on the long head. Additionally, it is not a shortened partial by design, which the dumbbell kickback does do. And finally, compared to a kickback where you have essentially no tension even in the somewhat lengthened position, this exercise offers plenty of tension even in that very stretched position.
All right, 6 exercises that suck, 6 that are better. Guys, remember, variation is awesome. There's tons of amazing exercises. These are just extremes. We're not telling you to never do the first bad exercises. And we're not telling you that the second good exercises are amazing in all contexts. We're saying on average, pick more exercises that have the features, the tension at the lengthened position, the proper biomechanics, the ability to have the resistance curve match the hypertrophic outcomes, et cetera, rather than exercises that, well, pretty much fumble most of those things. If you do better exercises than worse on average, you're gonna get better results. And if you follow Coach Milo Wolf on his own YouTube and as an author at Stronger by Science, you're just gonna learn a lot of stuff and it'll make you smarter. And you're gonna figure out that everyone else isn't as smart and you're gonna fall into a dark, deep depression. See you guys next time.